Hello there, this is Kelly Redmond, and I'm with the Western Regional Climate Center at the Desert Research Institute in Reno. And it's always great to be here in Bishop. I've been looking forward to coming down here, and let's get started. This is basically an update on the conditions from leading up to the autumn of 2013, and both looking back into the past and also looking out into the future a ways. It's about, and I don't need to show that. Here's what we mean by the Great Basin, basically. And I left these motivation items in here just for people to read. I don't think I need to go over them right now, but these are for the recorded online version. The idea being that this is mostly about the here and now, what's going on in the current year, and whatever led up to that, and wherever that might go in the next 6 months, or maybe a year, maybe even out longer than that. And just a reminder that many of the products and tools that we're showing here are reachable either at or through the WRCC web pages. That's one set of pages. We also have another set of pages that have been developed in conjunction with the USDA Farm Services Agency and other agencies that are concerned with drought in the Great Basin. And the idea is to be able to get a quick snapshot of what's going on. The web address shown on the screen there is gb-dri.edu. And there's also some products and capabilities that I'm not going to spend much time on that are available through the Department of Interior, the Southwest Climate Science Center, which is also, we have a web page, and we're part of this at WRCC in Reno. And we have another climate monitoring dashboard there. The address is given on the screen, and the subject matter here is a little bit broader area than just the Great Basin, and just the Great Basin itself. It's the 6 southwestern states. So since the last time we got together, just a kind of a recap of the winter that we had. And we have three areas here: the northern, central, and southern Sierra. The black line is the long-term climatology, so it reaches 100% of its maximum, usually about the beginning of April or so, right about here. So that's 100 by definition, and other values are referenced to that. So you can see, for instance, the biggest snowpack on record, which was 82-83. The smallest one on record, which was in 76-77, and then the last 2 years. First, the previous year shown in green, if I can find the cursor, shown in green, showing a dry start to the year. It picked up later in the year, but melted out early. In the north, the central, and the south, the purple line shows the winter that ended last summer, the water year that just ended. And that got a kind of an early start to the year, but then it really flattened out, and it just went downhill from there, and the 2 years ended up about the same. There was more of a difference in the between the northern and central and southern Sierra. There was especially a little bit on the lower side in the southern Sierra compared with the northern Sierra, and some of that may show up here as we proceed through this. So here's a spot that's in the middle of the Sierra Nevada, namely along Interstate 80 over Donner Summit. This is Central Sierra Snow Lab, which has got a really long record going back to about 1868 or so. And so we show the previous 3 winters, and especially we go back an extra winter to 2010 and 11, because that was such a big winter. Long-term average accumulated snowpack reaches a maximum of around 30 to 35 inches at the Central Sierra Snow Lab. That winter, the values got up to if I can get the cursor to show up. That winter the values got up to 70 to 75 inches or so, and then it melted out in about mid or late June. The climatology is shown by this line. The actual conditions of that year are shown by the blue line. The tan line shows the accumulated precipitation for the water year, which normally ends up around 70 to 75 inches or so, and the red line shows the accumulation in that year, and how much, showing that it was more than usual. So it was a pretty wet winter. This is the winter after that, the winter that ended the year 1 year ago, and you can see it's got the same climatology, obviously, but it started out really on the low side. It picked up. It never really reached anywhere during the year. It reached climatological values. Precipitation accumulation was quite low. We had about 40 or 50 days in November, December, and some of January without practically any precipitation at all. It was a record-breaking December in a lot of areas, and then made up somewhat for that later in the year. Contrast that with the winter that just ended, the water year that just ended at the end of September of 2013. That one started, compared to climatology, which again is the light blue line, had some pretty strong storms that came in toward the end of November and then again in December, but then there was nothing much after that, and it melted out, and the ground was pretty much bare by about the middle of April on Donner Summit. So, but if you flew over it, this is on a trip looking out a Southwest Airlines window on the way down to San Diego on May 1st, and you can see that there is snow on the ground, but it's hard to tell by looking at it. This is why we need the numbers, actually, whether it's above or below normal, because even a light year looks pretty white around the beginning of May. So let's take a recap of the 6 months that led up to where we are right now. This is the percent of average precipitation over the western states. The Great Basin, by the way, kind of wanders into different parts of the West, so we need a kind of a wide map to show it, because all the sub areas have a boundary usually right along one of the state lines, and they don't show the whole Great Basin in its entirety. So I'm looking at the whole West here, and this is showing the percent of average for April and then May in the middle diagram on the top, and then June, and all of these are showing below average precipitation for those 3 months, which continued the trend that was set in the first 3 months of 2013. And June is climatologically a pretty dry month, so it's no surprise you didn't get too much there, but that's a basically 0 to 5 or 25% of almost nothing. Then July, August, and September brought more precipitation to the area when the monsoon came in, which was about on time this year, I think. And anything that's on these diagrams that is above yellow, which is between 75 and 100%, anything in green or blue or purple is above average on these graphs. So they had a very, very dry July up in the Klamath area, but various wet spots in July, and then again in August in the Great Basin, a little bit more on the western side. And then September is a very unusual month, quite a bit above average in precipitation over most parts of the West. It's a really strongly anomalous year, or month, I mean, in that sense, and actually had some flooding in parts of Oregon and Washington. When we look at temperature over the last 6 months, again, each of the individual 6 months, April was on the warm side in this part of the Great Basin, and on the cool side in the northwestern part of the northeastern part of the Great Basin, I mean, and on up toward Montana and the Dakotas. May was kind of near average. You can see greens and yellows, which are sort of below, just below and just above long-term average temperature over much of the Great Basin. June was a pretty warm month, and we had some of the earliest. We had actually in Reno we had the earliest 100-degree reading by a week that we've had in Reno's history. I believe this year Death Valley had its earliest 100-degree reading on record back in it seems like it was in April. And we had also some very warm nights in June. There was a couple of days in Reno that had minimums of 67 degrees, which were records for the month of June. July was above average and well above average, and in fact record-setting above average in the northern Great Basin. Places like Boise had one of its warmest Julys on record. There are several cities that were the warmest July and therefore the warmest month on record, in their record. August was above normal in the northern and northeastern part of the Great Basin, but a little bit cooler than average, associated with that precipitation that came in during August, and which produced cloud cover and kind of hold the temperatures down. Same was true in September, with the wet conditions. There were a lot of cloud cover, and that kind of suppressed the heating and kept the temperatures close to or a little bit below average, except away from that area. Even though it was above average in precipitation up in the northern Great Basin, it was also above average in temperature as well. So we just ended the monsoon period, which starts right around the 4th of July or so. Usually comes into Arizona, New Mexico, and typically preferentially affects Arizona or New Mexico more than the other. It usually doesn't affect both states equally, but this year there was both of them actually ended up, I would say predominantly, just looking at these graphics, predominantly above average in precipitation for the 3 months, July, August, September, and in the left-hand side. And there's still some pockets, though, of areas like up around the lower Humboldt and the terminus of the Truckee and Carson rivers that stayed below normal, also around the Bishop area here. And in temperature, the monsoon period was near to somewhat above average in the southern part of Nevada, and more above average in northern Nevada and the northern Great Basin. So we've got just assorted pictures just tossed in here to kind of keep people awake, I guess. This is taken out of our office building up at the Desert Research Institute in Reno. This is Slide Mountain, which is a ski area just outside of Reno. We got a bunch of weather instruments on the top, but it looked like it was erupting that day. It just looked a little interesting. We had some nice showers in early June that came in over the Truckee Meadows. And so we get back to the temperature history here. This is, if we look at these 11 western states, just to recap where we started, this is the history of temperature over those 11 western states that you just saw, going back to 1895 and up through the end of 2012. So these are annual mean temperatures. And this shows the typical up and down you get from one year to the next. The blue line smooths it out with an 11-year running mean, just to be just to see some of these short-term trends a little bit easier. You can always see the standout year there of 1934, and then if we follow this warming period that started up here in the mid to early 70s, rose in a kind of an unsteady way until about the late 1990s. Then it kind of flattened out these years right through here. We had 4 years in a row that were cooler than they had been, but not as cool, not as but still warmer than the long-term historical record. And then in 2012 the temperature really popped back up again, and it was really quite warm. And you can see that here, what these patterns look like in space. If we just look at that later period from the year 2000 up through current period, anything on these diagrams that is yellow or orange or red is above average in temperature compared with the 1950 to 1995 mean. And the main message that comes out of these figures is that the West for pretty much every year had most of the West was above average in temperature. 2005, 2006, 2007. Starting in 2008, those 4 years I mentioned, we have a little bit different pattern. And if we advance it a little bit to put them all together, here's 2008, 9, 10, and 11, the 4 years I was picking out. We had a cool pattern in the Midwest, which also extended to parts of the western United States and parts of the Great Basin. And that kind of helped cool it off. And then the year 2010 didn't really have the cool period, but it wasn't all that warm either. The one thing that is kind of a common all the way through here is that the southwestern states, the far southwestern states, stayed above average all the way on through, including 2011 in the lower tier down here. And then finally 2012 came along. That was the warmest year in the United States history, and it was the warmest. It was very warm in the western states as well, including the Great Basin. And here we are for 2013, kind of a similar thing. It's been cool in parts of the Great Basin, but the year so far, at least through August, we don't have the September values because of the government shutdown, is above average in the southwestern states once again so far. So to go back and look at last winter again, here's the start we had to October, November, December. And it was quite wet. It had a few of these atmospheric rivers coming in that brought a lot of precipitation to the Great Basin, or excuse me, to the Sierra Nevada. And of course those are the source waters for the east side rivers that drain into the Great Basin. But it cut off pretty abruptly, and October, November, December themselves were not all that wet in the Great Basin, only in basins affecting the Great Basin. When it got into the next 4 months, January through April, these are the figures that we had as of the Great Basin Climate Forum, which was held in early May. It was a decidedly different picture. It just about completely dried up. These are the percent of averages, and they're pretty low percentages for those 4 months. Looking at temperature for those same 2 periods, October through December, temperatures were above average at the start of winter last year, October, November, December, but then cooled off, and we had some really cool and cold temperatures with the widespread inversion that set in, especially in the winter months in the eastern part of the Great Basin. Decidedly cool, and obviously this is going to have an effect on any kind of plants and animals that live there. It didn't have a deep snowpack, they had some. So adding those two together and looking at the water year, I'm going back 3 years now to show you the contrast between the winter that ended 2 years ago and then the succeeding 2 winters. So this is the winter that did end 2 years ago, and anything that's in deep purple here was between 150 and 200% of average. And so a very wet year, and most of the region was quite wet. There was a sharp dividing line through about the Four Corners area and southeast of there. It was quite a dry winter. But the area in the Great Basin was generally above average over most of the Great Basin. Then we contrast that with the year that followed that, and it was decidedly different. It was much drier, and drier over almost the entire area. A few pockets here that are on the wet side. So, and then we move forward one more year. This is the year that just ended about 2 weeks ago, and this is the water year that ended about 2 weeks ago. And again, another dry year, and especially in the western part of the Great Basin, and on down here to Bishop. But over much of the Great Basin, there's a few wetter pockets here, like around Tonopah and Mount Charleston area, and up toward the western side of the Great Salt Desert. If we look at this a different way, instead of percentages, we look at percentiles, which is the ranks. So anything in these diagrams that is in the greenish colors is in the top 1/3, in the little more greenish colors in the top 10%, and in the yellow is in the bottom third, and the tan is the bottom 10%. So October, November, December were mildly wet, sort of medium wet, I guess I would say, for last year. And then January through May, so we got the first 5 months of the year. Anything that is in this maroon color here, or deep kind of reddish, was the record driest since 1895. So that's almost 120 years. And this is the driest start to a year in those locations. This is from the Prism grid, which is on a 4-kilometer grid resolution. And anything in the tan is in the lowest 10%. So a major part of this area, and in fact the entire Great Basin, was on the dry side, and some of it was on the very dry side. So if we advance this a little further and look at January through September, the year all the way through September, again a similar picture. This is the driest start to a year in the historical record for the areas that are shown in the kind of deep reddish colors here, which extends into the Great Basin. If you look at the water year, which combines that somewhat wet start, so that diminishes the wet contours up here, the wet pattern. It was kind of a nondescript, some wet, some dry when you average over the water year. But south of about Tahoe or so, it was it was below average, and even in parts of the area down maybe around Bakersfield, around the southern Central Valley, it's at or close to the driest water year on record in a few parts of central Nevada. This is according to the Prism estimates. There are a few near average spots in the Great Basin, partly on the strength of the wet September that occurred. And if you look at temperature over the preceding water year, the one that just ended, so this is the 12 months that ended in September of this year, you can see there was a kind of a mixed pattern to it, generally a little bit more above than below, but there's some areas that were on the cool side. It's sort of a broad swath here extending northwest to southeast that was not as warm as the areas more to the north, like up here in central Idaho, and more to the south, like in the Bishop area and over into Southern California. And again, if we look at the temperature rank for October through September, so this is the 12-month period, it shows a similar kind of picture. There's some areas that, according to Prism, were at or close to their it says record driest. It should say record warmest. Sorry about that. And which are in the tan and reddish colors. There's a few areas here that look like they were a little bit below normal in temperature in terms of their rank, but not. They're just isolated areas in general. So looking at this a different way, this is looking at precipitation. There's a couple of indices that they use in California to keep track of Sierra precipitation. One is something called the Northern Sierra 8-Station Index, and it's these 8 cities right here. So it covers the Sierra down to about Tahoe, or just a little bit below. And again, you can see that. So the long-term average is the accumulation ends up from October through the end of September, ends up at 50 inches even. It just works out that way. The two winters ago, they ended up with 72.7 inches, so well above average. The year before last is this blue line here. You can see the dry start. There was one big storm here, another big storm here, and then it ended up here a little bit below average, medium below average, I'd say. And last year started out a lot like the winter 2 years ago, but then just quit altogether almost. And there's a few wet periods here, and it ended up rather close to the year before. So we had 2 dry winters in a row, but they got there in different ways. And this can be sort of important for some natural processes and plants and animals and so forth that It's the pathway by which they got there sometimes, rather than just what the total ended up being. And you can see quite a big distinction here between the two winters. The other thing that's really of interest is how much single storms. There's one storm right there where the accumulated total rose quite a bit. Here's another one in March of 2 years ago, showing how important single storms can be. If we move south to the San Joaquin River, we've got 5 stations there that are used that have a fairly long record, and they still continue to produce records. It's a similar picture. Their average is about 41 inches, and they ended up with 65 2 years ago, so it was even wetter compared with average, the Southern Sierra, and it was drier than compared with average in the Northern Sierra. In the Southern Sierra, the last 2 winters, you can see they ended up almost exactly the same here on the diagram. But again, they got there by totally different ways. One started wet and ended dry. The other started dry and ended wet, and they ended up quite similar to each other. And you can also see how important, just whether or not you got that one big storm here had a fair influence on how much the annual precipitation was. So here's some values that that were obtained from the National Weather Service. This is from Barry Pierce at Las Vegas, and we're just focusing on the right-hand column here just so I can pick out some of the numbers. So, for example, Needles had about 5.8 inches, 125% of average. Bishop here had 2.34 inches, which is 45% of average. This is the lowest percentage I can find anywhere in the Great Basin for any town. So Bishop didn't make out so well, a mere 2 1/3 inches, and in fact, what's quite impressive is that Death Valley ended up with more precipitation this water year, 2.40 inches compared with 2.34, and ended at 102%. So Bishop wasn't even as wet as Death Valley in the last year or so, and that's really had some consequences to the water deliveries out of the Owens Valley into the aqueduct. A few more sites in this area. Here's Pahrump down here, 4.06 inches, which is about 80% of average. And just on the other side of the White Mountains, I would say that Dyer is in drier straits, so to speak. 2.47 inches. They're about a little bit less than half right down here of average, and Joshua Tree to the south of us, 2.66, which is also about half the average. Looking over into the county warning area covered by the Elko National Weather Service office, here's the September values, which are all pretty impressive. Winnemucca, Elko, Ely, and Tonopah, 150 to 200%, and Tonopah is 363% for their precipitation, and which really helped tremendously with their water year. We had a couple of very wet days. This is over at Mather, which I'll show you toward the end of this talk. Show you a picture of it. This is a Ross station in Great Basin National Park. The Baker CRN is another very high quality station, part of a national network that had 2.30 inches. Mather had 2.37 inches in 24 hours. So this is a fair fraction of their annual precipitation, and over about 5 days or so, had around 3 to 3.5 inches at these locations. A very wet period here in September. So the water year still ended up below normal in Winnemucca at 66, Elko 78, Ely 92, but Tonopah, on the strength of that wet September, ended up with about 100% of its long-term average. There's some flood reports that were reported in just during the month of September. I just copied a few of them down just to show you how widespread they were. There are a lot of places that had water that was 1 or 2 foot deep running through the middle of towns and over roads and depositing debris and rock and mud on the roads. Just some examples from the Weather Service here in the first half of September.